Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I compared the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D and 7800X 3D and found the newer, more expensive Zen 4 3D V-Cache part was on average about 20% faster in the more CPU-limited gaming scenarios, but was also up to 50% faster under the right conditions. In the end, it seemed pretty clear that for those of you already on the previous generation AM4 platform, that the upgrade to the 5800X 3D was going to make the most financial sense, while those of you looking to build an entirely new PC were best off spending a bit more on the 7800X 3D. However, there is another AMD option at this price tier, the Ryzen 7 7700 for $320, and it should deliver similar performance to that of the 5800X 3D, while giving you access to features and future support of the AM5 platform. So today we're adding the 7700 to the dataset, but before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by HyperX and their latest cloud gaming headset, the Cloud 3. This latest iteration features new high-quality angled 53mm drivers that delivers accurate and detailed sound by directing audio into the ears at a more optimal position, and a lifetime activation of DTS Headphone X for accurate 3D audio spatialization, along with a detachable 10mm cardioid microphone. In terms of design and quality, the Cloud 3s build upon what HyperX achieved with the previous model, and that means a full metal construction with leatherette ear cups, making for a lightweight and very comfortable headset. Great emphasis has been placed on the ease of use and flexibility of the Cloud 3s. For example, the onboard ear cup controls for adjusting the volume or muting the mic are easy to access, and with support for 3.5mm audio connectivity, along with USB Type A or Type C, means they support a wide range of use cases. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, for testing, the 5800X 3D was used on the MSI MPG X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi motherboard with G-Skill's DDR4 3600CL14 32GB memory. Meanwhile, the 7700 and 7800X 3D were installed on the Gigabyte X670 eAorus Master using the latest F11C BIOS revision with DDR5 6000CL30 memory, again from G-Skill. Then for the graphics card, we of course have the Asus ROG Strix RTX 4090 OC edition, which has been benchmarked at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, so let's get into it. Starting with Hogwarts Legacy using the Ultra Quality preset, we find the results are heavily CPU limited at 1080p and 1440p, though to varying degrees depending on the CPU used. What's interesting here is just how fast the Ryzen 7 7700 is when compared to the older 5800X 3D, delivering 13% more performance at 1080p and 17% more at 1440p. Even at 4K, it is still 7% faster, though it was also 12% slower than the 7800X 3D. Then at the more CPU-limited 1080p resolution, the 7700 was 18% slower than the 7800X 3D, so the 3D V-Cache certainly does help here, but so does DRAM bandwidth, and DDR5 is providing the 7700 with a real advantage over the 5800X 3D. And it's a similar situation with ray tracing enabled. Here the 7700 is 16% faster than the 5800X 3D at 1080p, but also 17% slower than the 7800X 3D, so basically it ends up right in the middle. Though it is interesting to note that the 1% lows of the 5800X 3D and 7700 are very similar, while the 7800X 3D does enjoy a serious performance advantage. Next up we have Spider-Man Remastered, and in this example the 7700 is slower than the 5800X 3D, at least when comparing the average frame rate. The 1% lows on the other hand, they're basically identical. The average frame rate at 1080p is 11% lower when compared to the 5800X 3D and 18% lower than that of the 7800X 3D. We're also seeing similar margins at 1440p, but by the time we reach the 4K resolution, the data is almost entirely GPU limited. Then with ray tracing enabled, we find that the 5800X 3D and 7700 are now much more evenly matched with basically identical performance, making the 7700 12% slower than the 7800X 3D at 1080p. Moving on to Fortnite, and as we found previously, these higher-end CPUs are able to max out the RTX 4090 in this title, and this also applies to the 7700. And again, we are using the epic quality settings here. And even with hardware ray tracing enabled, we see no real difference between these CPUs when using the epic quality settings. The Last of Us does play better with the 7700 opposed to the 5800X 3D, at least when CPU limited, and we see that at 1080p, the Zen 4 processor was 17% faster. though that margin is heavily reduced at 1440p and then eliminated entirely at 4K. And this also meant that it was just 7% slower than the 7800X3D at 1080p and was able to match it at the higher resolutions due to the GPU bottleneck. Next up we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and the 7800X3D is exceptionally fast in this title, but sadly the same can't be said of the 7700, which was 32% slower. In fact, the 7700 was also 14% slower than the 5800X3D, and while 130 FPS on average is nothing to scoff at, it's clear that the Zen processors really require a larger L3 buffer for optimal performance in this title. Even at 1440p, the 7700 was still 19% slower than the 7800X3D and 15% slower than the 5800X3D. And in fact, it wasn't until we hit the 4K resolution that the GPU bottleneck was so great that it neutralized any performance differences. Like Fortnite, the Halo Infinite performance was much the same using any one of these three CPUs, so there's not really that much to see here. And it's the same story in Total War Warhammer 3, despite being quite a CPU demanding game. All three CPUs tested here are more than powerful enough to extract the maximum performance from the RTX 4090. The Ryzen 7 7700 matched the performance of the 5800X3D and F122 at 1080p, with 201 FPS on average, which is a great result, though that did also make it 17% slower than the 7800X3D. But of course, once we jump up to 1440p, the results are entirely GPU limited, and that being the case, we also find the same at 4K. Cyberpunk 2077 is mostly GPU limited in our testing, even with the RTX 4090 at 1080p using the high preset, so not ultra. The 7700 did match the 5800X3D at 1080p, making it just 9% slower than the 7800X3D, and then by the time we reach the 1440p resolution, performance is the same across the board. Now, if we enable ray tracing, the margin to the 7800X3D remains about the same. Here the 7700 was 10% slower at 1080p, but it's now 6% faster than the 5800X3D, or 16% faster when looking at the 1% lows. Still, once we jump up to 1440p and 4K, the results are heavily GPU limited, so performance is the same using any one of the three CPUs tested. The Callisto Protocol isn't particularly CPU intensive, at least not to the degree where CPU performance is an issue with any of these Zen 3 and Zen 4 processors, and as a result performance is very similar at all three tested resolutions. Hitman 3 is a CPU demanding game, though all three CPUs tested here can drive over 200 FPS. Still, the 7700 was 10% slower than the 7800X3D at 1080p, but also 13% faster than the 5800X3D, so it was interesting to find the non-3D Vcache part situated between the two X3D parts. Okay, so the 7800X3D is incredibly fast in Far Cry 6, whereas the 7700 not so much, and really does perform more like the 5800X3D. So still plenty fast, but it is around 25% slower than the 7800X3D, at least at 1080p. The margin was reduced to 17% at 1440p and then just 5% at 4K. Now we see that the 7700 does deliver 5800X3D-like performance once again, this time in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, as it trailed by just a 4% margin at 1080p, with similar results seen at 1440p and then identical performance at 4K. When compared to the 7800X3D, we're looking at up to a 15% loss for the 7700 in this title. And in this example, the 7700 just nudged out the 5800X3D in Rainbow Six Siege. We're talking about a mere 3% margin at 1080p. Meanwhile, it was 13% slower than the 7800X3D at 1440p, and then just 3% slower at 4K. Next up, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and here the 7700 was good for 252 FPS at 1080p, making it 7% slower than the 7800X3D, but 11% faster than the 5800X3D. So once again, the 7700 finds itself situated between the two X3D parts. And it's a similar story at 1440p, and of course, once we hit 4K, the results are entirely GPU limited. Moving on to ACC, here we have a game that we know plays very well with AMD's 3D Vcache, and as a result, the 7700 is quite a bit slower than the 5800X3D, up to 20% slower in fact. That also meant it was a whopping 33% slower than the 7800X3D at 1080p and even 25% slower at 4K. And this is all while using the Epic quality preset. The Resident Evil 4 results are quite surprising, as I expected the 7700 to match or even beat the 5800X3D, I'm not exactly sure why I expected that, as I haven't really done any CPU testing with this game, but in any case, the ACC-like margins were a surprising find. At 1080p, the 7700 was 16% slower than the 5800X3D, and a massive 31% slower than the 7800X3D. We saw similar margins at 1440p, and it wasn't until we reached the 4K resolution that the data became heavily GPU limited. A Plague Tale Requiem delivered results that are more in line with what I was expecting from Resident Evil 4. Here the 7700 finds itself situated between the 5800X3D and 7800X3D, and at 1080p it was 10% slower than the 7800X3D and 15% faster than the 5800X3D. Again, similar margins were seen at 1440p, with 4K being the equalizer. The 5800X3D and 7700 were quite evenly matched in Watch Dogs Legion, making the 7700 22% slower than the 7800X3D at 1080p, and then 20% slower at 1440p, while we found just a 5% margin at 4K. The second last game we tested with is the Riftbreaker, and this also saw the 7700 delivering similar performance to that of the 5800X3D, though the 1% lows were consistently better, even at 4K. When compared to the 7800X3D, the 7700 was 14% slower at 1080p, 10% slower at 1440p, and then just 2% slower at 4K. Finally, we have the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 results, and like Fortnite and Halo for example, these results are heavily GPU limited, despite using the RTX 4090, though we are using the ultra quality preset here. Okay, so we've taken a look at how the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, 5800X3D, and 7700 compare across a wide range of games. Now it's time to break down all of that data to get a clearer picture of how these three CPUs compare. At the more CPU-limited 1080p resolution, we found that on average, the 7700 was just 13% slower than the 7800X3D, which is actually quite a sizable margin for the CPU to make. It's also worth noting that there are examples where the 7700 was slower by a 30% margin or more, so as is often the case, the margins are very much game dependent. Now, when compared to the similarly priced 5800X3D, we're looking at virtually identical performance, as here the 7700 was on average just a single percent faster. And as you can see across the games tested, they traded blows, and there's certainly no clear indication as to which one of these CPUs will age better for games. Of course, at 1440p the results did tend to become more GPU limited, and as a result, the 7700 is now just 9% slower than the 7800X3D on average. Again, there are a few titles that saw significant margins, but there were many more where the margin was less than 5%. Again, when compared to the 5800X3D, we're looking at basically the same overall performance from the 7700, and although the 7700 was typically faster, the margins were small, leading to once again just a single percent advantage for the Zen 4 processor. Then at 4K, the data is almost entirely GPU limited, with just two meaningful examples in ACC and Hogwarts Legacy, leading to the 7700 trailing the 7800X3D by a mere 3% margin. And of course, it is a similar situation when comparing the 7700 and 5800X3D. Again, the Zen 4 processor was 1% faster overall, and typically we're looking at low single-digit margins. So there you have it. The Ryzen 7 7700 is very similar to the 5800X3D when it comes to gaming performance, which is great news for new system builders, as you no longer have to toss up between saving money with AM4 or paying a premium for AM5 and its newer features and better platform support. Essentially, it's my opinion that the 5800X3D should now be ignored by new system builders, as you can build a new gaming PC using the 7700 for roughly the same amount of money, but with AM5 you receive support for future CPU generations and modern platform features such as DDR5 and PCIe 5.0. So, as I concluded in my previous 5800X3D versus 7800X3D comparison, the 5800X3D really only makes sense for those of you already on the AM4 platform using a decent motherboard and memory combo. For those users, the 5800X3D is no doubt a godsend, offering an affordable and convenient means of massively boosting gaming performance. For new system builders though, Zen 4 just makes more sense, especially now that AM5 motherboard and DDR5 memory prices have settled right down. Of course, a viable alternative is Intel's 13th Gen series, and I think my next stop will be to compare the 7700 and 7800X3D with perhaps the Core i7 13700K using DDR5 7200 memory. So let me know what you think about that comparison, or just what you'd like to see next. And with that, I'm going to end this video. If you liked it, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. As I said, I can add other CPUs to these this data set, and we have some other cool content coming up that you're not going to miss. Also, you can join us over at Floatplane or Patreon. Signing up to either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server for members only, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.